Good evening. My name is Jason Wallace. I'm the pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church here in the Salt Lake Valley. We welcome you to another installment of the Ancient Paths. Last week we were privileged to have with us Kevin Swanson. He is a pastor within our presbytery in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and he had also been in town to be the keynote speaker at the Utah Christian Homeschool Convention. So we taped an episode while he was here and aired that last week, and hope you enjoyed it. Before we get started, I'd like to invite you to come worship with us. We meet at 8630 West, 2700 South. That's Main Street in Magna. We're renovating a 19th century building there, and we're in the chapel already, and soon we'll hopefully have the rest of the ground floor finished. We also have evening services. The morning service is at 11 a.m. and the evening service is at 6:30 in Logan. We have a mission work there, and we're going through the Gospel of Luke on Sunday mornings, and in Logan we're going through the book of Hebrews. That's at 6:30 at 1315 East, 700 North, just off the campus of Utah State University. I invite you to come and worship with us. I want to pick back up our series in terms of dealing with the nature of God, but before we do that, I wanted to follow up on the interview that we had last week with Kevin Swanson, because what we were focusing on were the practical implications of all this, these concepts, all this doctrine that we've been laying out. It has real-world implications, and it's transformative when we understand truly the nature of God, the nature of man, the nature of sin and reconciliation in Jesus Christ. How do we live as Christians? It's when we have a depth of understanding of our nature and what we have been saved from and what we've been saved to, that we then have a basis on which that we can then live in relationships with one another. And Kevin talked a bit about the reformation that is needed in the home and within the church as well. Many people want to focus on a reformation in the state, but they don't want to focus on what really has to take place first, which is we have to begin with a reformation in the home and in the church. And so if you did not see that, that's available on our website. That's ancientpathstv.blogspot.com. That has a link to all the different shows that we've done so far. But I wanted to flesh that out a little more. What is the implication of our theology for how we live? And I want to focus particularly on the home and on marriage and children. When people come to me and want to be married, they often come to me with a rose-colored view of how life is to be. They think that they've met the perfect person, they're going to get married, and they're going to ride off into the sunset together and live happily ever after. Because in our culture, we have made romantic love an idol. And we have actually, to a great degree, deified romantic love. That all you need is love. All you need is this other person. They're the one that's going to fill up what's missing in you. They're the one that is going to answer all your questions. They're going to be the reason that you can go on living. And so there's this idol that we have created, and the problem that people find is that when they get married, they're not married to Prince Charming or to some wonderful princess. They're married to a sinner. When I have people come in and want to talk about marriage, wanting me to perform the ceremony for them, we get all the niceties out of the way, and I have them sit down, and then I look at the young lady, the bride-to-be, and I ask her, so are you prepared to submit to this man when you think he's a stupid, selfish jerk? And she's stunned, because it's unimaginable to her that this man that she's intending to marry could ever be a stupid, selfish jerk. And she'll protest and say, well, I think John is just the most wonderful man in the world. John is the sweetest guy I've ever met in my life. It's like, no. That John is a fiction. You're marrying a sinner. You're marrying someone that, apart from the grace of God, could be a murderer, a thief, a liar, all kinds of things. And then I turn to the husband-to-be, and I ask him, are you prepared to love this woman as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it? Are you prepared to be self-sacrificial when you think that your wife is a raving, nagging shrew? And she's, Jane is just the most wonderful girl in the world. The reality is that we are all sinners. The reality is that marriage is meant as a means of sanctification. It's a means to show us not only is the other person lacking, not only is the other person in need of sanctification, but so are we. I had someone that I had gone through this counseling with a number of months ago that they're married now, and the husband told me, he said, you were right. He said, I'm not nearly as nice a guy as I thought I was, because what happens is you put two sinners into the most intimate relationship there is, and they can't get away from each other, and their faults become readily apparent to one another. So what do? Well, the nature of the relationship is that the wife is called to submit. Submission does not simply mean doing what you feel like doing. That means you're getting your way. Submission means that you do what you don't feel like doing. Submission means that when you think that your husband has the wrong idea, you can talk about it respectfully, all like this, but when the husband makes a decision, even if you think he's wrong, you have to obey. It doesn't mean that you keep arguing him down. It doesn't mean that you keep pressuring him. There comes a point where you submit. What I hear from people all the time is it's unimaginable to them to do something they don't agree with. Well, what do you do when you have two people who have different views of things? We're called to submit. In 1998, the Southern Baptists had their convention here in Salt Lake City, and they added a statement to the Baptist Faith and Message, the closest thing they have to a confessional statement. And in it, they said that a wife was to submit to her husband. And you would have thought that they were calling for people to be burned at the stake from some of the reactions that they got. Reverend Paul Sherry, the president of the United Church of Christ out of Cleveland, this is the denomination that Barack Obama is part of. Paul Sherry said, with all due respect, the convention is on the wrong side of history and I believe far out of step with the central message of the gospel. There were other people that went on to say that this was to try to take the church back 200 years. Actually, no, it's the message that has been taught in the Scriptures throughout, because we're told by the Apostle Paul in Ephesians that a wife is to submit to her husband. All the flack that they were getting was over adding a quotation from Scripture. And it's not something that's said in a vacuum. It's said also in Colossians chapter 3. There are other passages that deal with this kind of issue. And the wife is called to submit. Even when she thinks that the husband is not acting in her best interest, even when she thinks that he's wrong, even when she thinks he's being foolish, if he's not leading her into sin, she's to obey him. That's a hard calling. But what's an even harder calling is that this is a call that is given to both. The husband is also called to submit in a different way. He's to submit his own desires under that of his wife. He is to be self-sacrificial, and he is to give himself for his wife, even when he thinks that she's not living up to what she's supposed to do. Now, we live in a culture where people are told that the way to happiness is to do what you feel like doing. Now, when we study all these different doctrines about the holiness of God, about how man was created, how man fell, we come to doctrines such as original sin. And people often will go glassy-eyed and say, what difference does that make in my life? Well, the difference is that when we understand the nature of our sinfulness, that we're not born into this world good people, that apart from the grace of God, we would be just like everyone else. Paul says to the Ephesians in chapter 2. We were children of wrath, even as the rest, but God had mercy. And he can say of himself in Romans chapter 7 that even as a Christian, that the things that he would do, those are not the things he does. The things he would not do, those are the things he often does. And he says there's nothing good in him, that is in his flesh. What is good is Christ living in him. And yet you're living in between. If you think that it doesn't matter what you believe, you really haven't wrestled with what the Scriptures say about the Christian life. Because what some people will tell you is that if you just had enough faith, then you could graduate. You could jump to this mature level. You wouldn't wrestle with temptation. You wouldn't wrestle with all these other things. You would essentially walk 3 feet off the ground, fairly untouched by this fallen world. And what that does is it turns people inward. And they get frustrated with themselves if they actually take it seriously. That or they turn into Pharisees. But if you think that your answer is just you have to muster up enough faith, then it's a dead end. J.I. Packer, who has really written some wonderful stuff in the past, but has almost nothing negative to say about anybody anymore, he still is hard against the perfectionist because he's been there. And they tell you that if you just seek out this experience, if you can turn within yourself and find this, then you can be mature. It's bunk. It'll lead you to despair. It'll lead you to thinking, am I really even a Christian because I'm struggling so? These doctrines matter because they shape the way we live. If we believe that we are by nature sinners, then we live in a different way than if we think that we're naturally good people. If we think that our children don't need to be taught to steal, to lie, to be selfish, if we think that they're born little innocents into the world and that all they need is just a little encouragement and they're going to be wonderful, it's going to shape the way we treat children. It's going to shape the way that we focus all our efforts. So how do the things that we hold to, the historic faith of the Christian church, how do these things shape marriage? Well, for one thing, we don't reinvent marriage. We don't make marriage to fit what we want it to be. Marriage is not something that was created by the state. The state may recognize marriage, but you cannot redefine marriage to include a man, or a man and a dog, or a man and a toaster, or a man and a woman. You can't redefine marriage in any way that you might choose. Marriage was instituted by God. And we have this hubris, this arrogance in our day that we think that because we have higher technology, that we somehow are more advanced than everyone that has ever lived before us. We may be more advanced in terms of our transportation and some other things, but in terms of how we live, we've actually fallen away. There's actually been a devolution, a breaking down rather than an evolution to some higher level. Women are called to obey because the reality is that there has to be someone to make a decision. And the husband is to make that decision. At the same time, the husband is charged that he cannot make that decision based on his own desires. He has to make that decision based first on what God tells him. Second, what is best for his wife. It may not be what she wants, but what is best for his wife. And only third, what he desires. And so we're called to self-sacrifice. If wives wait for their husbands to be worthy to submit to them, they're not going to submit. And if husbands wait for their wives to submit before they self-sacrificially lead them, then it's all going to break down. One of the scenarios that you'll often see within the community is that you'll have two people that will get married. And God made us to complement one another. We're different. It's been a revelation in the last 10, 15 years to many social scientists that the differences between men and women are not simply acculturated. They're not something that are just learned. That there are real differences between men and women. Not everyone is the same, and this is not thus saith the Lord. It is thus saith the Lord that we're made to complement each other, but in terms of how that manifests itself, one of the things that I think that you'll see in terms of just general revelation looking around you is that men tend to be more goal-oriented. Men tend to think big picture. Men, if they have a problem, when you throw sin into the mix, they lose the trees for the forest because they see the big picture. Women tend to be more task-oriented. When men think about raising a child, men often think about getting the child born, getting them home, getting them walking, talking, major milestones. This is the way that men tend to think. Women, on the other hand, think about all the little steps in between. If babies didn't cry and men had to raise them, we might starve them to death because we can be neglectful about thinking about all the different things that are in between. Thankfully, God made them to cry and tell us that we're dropping the ball somewhere. What happens when you bring two sinners together where we're created to complement each other, but now selfishness has entered the equation. Sin has entered, and man's temptation is not to love his wife first, but to love himself first. The woman's temptation is not to submit and to trust God that he will deal with her husband, but rather to do everything in her power to make sure that he does what's right. When you bring two people together, they're all misty-eyed, they think wonderful things of each other, but then they get married, they go on their honeymoon, they come back, they begin to live real life. And so what happens is men thinking goal-oriented, thinking big picture. When you throw sin into the mix, men become irresponsible. Men procrastinate. And so when they start talking about what are we going to do about our broken down car? When are we going to buy a house? When are we going to have children? All these different things. The temptation for a lot of guys is to say, we'll figure it out. Don't worry about it. It'll come together. And so the men don't lay out a clear plan. That frustrates the women. Often because women are better at being task-oriented, the husband will simply let the wife handle the checkbook. The wife sees all the bills that come in, sees all the money going out, and there's no clear plan about how all these things get put together. So the wife begins to become upset because she doesn't know where they're going. All that she hears from her husband is, "We'll see," or "Pretty soon. You know, we're gonna figure everything out, but let's not worry about it right now." The wife's natural response is to begin to nag her husband, to try to get him to be responsible, to lead her, to show her how are we going to get from point A to point B to point C to point D. How do we do these things? The husband, when the wife nags him, isn't often, very seldom does a man step back and say, I need to examine myself. Maybe I'm not being a godly husband. Maybe I'm not being faithful in doing what God has called me to do. Rather, the temptation for most guys is, what do I have to do to shut her up? We're sinners. The husband does what the wife wants, not out of a renewed sense of responsibility, but rather just to get her to shut up, and ends up withdrawing even a little more from taking authority and taking responsibility in the home. He's not being a godly leader. Instead, he's frustrated with his wife. The wife then is left with a vacuum that things aren't being done, and it's upsetting when things are not being done. There's a little caricature of how men do things that might resonate with some of you. When guys get into a car with half a tank of gas, what often goes through the guy's mind is, I wonder how far I can go before I have to fill up. It's a challenge. When women get into a car with half a tank of gas, the thought that goes through many women's minds, and there are differences, I'm not saying everyone is identical, but she begins to worry because she's going to run out of gas on the side of the road. She's going to get picked up by a biker gang. Horrible things are going to happen. She's going to get cut up in little pieces and spread over 7 states because her husband didn't love her enough to keep the car filled up with gas. When guys go on a trip by themselves, typically guys will say, let's go to southern Utah. They all pile into the car, they start heading south on I-15, and they turn to each other, where do you want to go? I don't know, where do you want to go? And you're heading south and you figure it out along the way. You start getting hungry, it's like, hey, let's go find something to eat. That's how you can drive a woman insane, typically, because women are different. Now, there are differences of personality. Like I said, this is not thus saith the Lord on this. What is thus saith the Lord is that we are made to complement each other, and that there has to be someone to make a decision. There has to be someone who finally breaks the tie, and it is to be the husband. Wives are called to obey their husbands. It's not something that was invented in the Victorian era. It's not something that is some Puritan invention. It is thus saith the Lord. Women are to obey their husbands, but husbands also have to love their wives. Now, I hope you see how some of this stuff works together. What happens when sin raises its head and the wife is not obeying? What is the husband supposed to do? What we find as we begin to apply what God tells us in His Word is that we can't change other people, but we are to do what we're supposed to do whether the other person does or not. The example is given of the unbelieving husband being won by the good conduct of his wife, that without a word, God convicts him. You know, if you really want to convict your husbands, obey them when you think they're wrong, and when they show themselves to be wrong, don't tell them that you told them so. Don't rub their nose in it, because that simply backs them into a corner, and a guy's temptation is to try to take that square peg and beat on that square peg to make it fit that round hole one way or another, just to show you. But if a wife actually lovingly submits, the last thing that the husband ever wants to do again is to abuse that trust. Husband generally knows when he's been wrong. What do you do when the husband is not loving? When he's being selfish? The wife still has to do what she's supposed to do. The husband still has to do what he's supposed to do regardless. And so these abstract doctrines they make all the difference in the world in how we live here and now. We're going to open up our phone lines and talk about some of these things a little more. The phone number here is 973-8820. That's 973-TV20. I was going into vapor lock for a moment there. Sorry about that. But how do you live with a sinner? Now, I laid out for you some of the typical interaction, but what you'll see is that you end up with this cycle of where it feeds on itself. The husband is irresponsible, and the wife nags him and ends up taking the role, stepping into the vacuum that the husband leaves. And they end up resenting each other more and more. And often what you'll find is that the husband, back home we refer to guys as good old boys, that they're hardworking, nice guys, but they're not responsible. They may be responsible at work, but they're not responsible necessarily in the home. And what happens is the people that are around him at work, they see him as a good guy, as a hardworking guy. He's always pleasant to everyone. And they hear about how his wife is just nagging him to no end. And he ends up confiding in a receptionist or something like this. She is married to a guy that doesn't do anything. And whenever they're around each other, there's just tension. There's bickering all the time. And so what happens is they begin to show attention to one another. They glow in one another's eyes, and things get carried away. And before you know it, they've run off together. They've each abandoned their rotten spouses. They marry one another, and 6 months later, they found out they're married to the same person all over again, because they did not recognize the nature of their own sinfulness. We can, when we underestimate the seriousness of sin within ourselves, we can become very good at picking out the speck in other people's eyes and ignoring the beam in our own. So we have to basically recapture the biblical view of the home, that husbands and wives are not just doing whatever they please, and their commitment is not simply to one another. I referred earlier about how in our culture with our pop songs, we tend to describe romantic love in the highest possible terms. And the idea is that it's in romantic love that we're going to find our purpose, our being, everything. But the reality is that a sinner makes a pitiful idol. I want to read you some lyrics. This is from a John Denver song back in the 70s called Annie's Song. And this is just a small part. He sings to his wife, "You fill up my senses like a night in the forest, like the mountains in springtime, like a walk in the rain, like a storm in the desert, like a sleepy blue ocean. You fill up my senses, come fill me again." And then there's the chorus, "Come, let me love you, let me give my life to you. Let me drown in your laughter, let me die in your arms. Let me lay down beside you, let me always be with you. Come, let me love you, let me come love me again." You cannot imagine stronger terms of being enraptured with the love of a woman. And yet, in spite of these wonderful, wonderful words, 8 years later, they're divorced. Because as wonderful as a woman may be, or as wonderful as a man may be, they're not God. If you want to sum up the difference between Reformed theology, which is what we've been teaching here, and a lot of evangelical and LDS theology, not all evangelicals, we're historic evangelicals, you can really boil it down to this: God is God and we are not. If your marriage is built primarily on your relationship to one another, you'll devour each other if you're not careful. Now, there are sinners, there are unregenerate people that can live in peace, or at least in some relative peace. But that's the mercy of God. How do most people live together when their nature is self-destructive? I believe that your relationship has to have the foundation of God. Your vows are made not just to one another horizontally, but your vows are made in the presence of God. Those vows are primarily vows to God. Because when a woman marries a man, it doesn't take long before she finds out he has feet of clay. He's not the perfect man. And there are a host of things that she can justify bad behavior over, and vice versa. A man can find out that a woman is not the perfect woman and justify all kinds of bad behavior. So you'll hear people put down what they call head knowledge of God. You know, I don't want to know about God. I just want to know God. I just want to experience Him. But it's as we have our view of the world straight, that then we begin to grasp, how do we function in this world? Because if we think that a song like Annie's song is supposed to be the norm, if we think that it's the feeling of love that is the bedrock of our marriage, then things aren't going to work properly. Things are going to break down because our feelings of love are going to tend to go up and down. What happens when people have to live with one another and they go through trials? You'll hear people all the time, well, we've just fallen out of love. The love grew cold. We're going to divorce because we've just grown apart. God is the one that established marriage. And when we have that foremost in our mind, that this is something that our Creator tells us is very good. Remember, marriage was ordained before the fall. God brought Eve to Adam, and He declares everything very good. Now, marriage has been tainted by sin, but it is still a blessing. But when you watch people, when they go for the feeling of love, you know, we're a society, and particularly within the evangelical church, we have so idolized feelings that when we start talking about these things, it leaves us empty, because the feeling of love is fleeting. And you'll see people that they have a feeling of love towards someone, then they get to know them. And all of a sudden the feeling of love gets a bit harder to find than it was before. And so then they find someone else they don't really know, and they have a feeling of love towards them. That leads to adultery. It leads to unfaithfulness. We need to recognize that often what is for our best is not what we feel like doing. If you want to become a manic depressive, do what you feel like doing. Now there are organic causes for some manic depression, but most manic depression comes from people telling you, do what you feel like doing. The problem is, we're sinners. What I feel like doing is not getting out of bed in the morning, every morning. What I feel like doing is staying up late and not doing my work. What I feel like doing is not disciplining my children. What I feel like doing is not being respectful to people that step on my toes. What I feel like doing, if I follow that, is going to be destructive. You see people, if you want to make a total wreck out of your children, let them sleep till 3 p.m. in the afternoon and stay up until 4 and 5 a.m. for no particular reason. We are conditioned to do what we feel like doing. You know, we have commercials telling us, have it your way. Do your own thing. And if we recognize that we're sinners, then we begin to realize that that's not a healthy approach. People will often stay up a bit late because they don't really feel like going to bed. And so then they don't feel like going to work in the morning. So then they call in and they make excuses. And they begin to fall behind at work. Their work situation grows tenser. They don't feel like going into work so much anymore. They end up staying up later. They end up losing their job. Then they don't feel like going out and finding another one. And it is debilitating. I have seen people that have been full-blown manic depressive, bipolar, even paranoid schizophrenic, that when they come to the realization, and I'm not saying everyone is in this boat, there are organic issues out there for many folks, but the church itself hasn't dealt with these things properly. We trivialize sin. We talk about feelings to the point that we don't stress that the nature of virtue is more often than not doing what we don't feel like doing. It is being self-sacrificial. It is doing the things that are hard. And so theology matters. Theology, the study of God, the understanding of the doctrines. What does the Bible say about who God is, about who we are, about the nature of sin, about the nature of salvation? If we don't grasp these things, we're doomed. I'd like to invite you to call us. It's a little bit of an odd subject tonight in line with, in comparison to some of the other things, but I wanted to sort of jump ahead because we had some feedback from some folks who said they didn't see the practical importance of these things. You may not agree with everything. Call in. I would love to hear your feedback. 973-TV20, 973-8820. So how does it affect how we raise our children? We alluded to this last week in the interview with Kevin Swanson, where the old Puritan view was that, as Jonathan Edwards put it, was that the children of believers were little vipers in covenant diapers. They were born sinners. Some might be born like John the Baptist, filled with the Holy Spirit from his mother's womb, but generally we're to recognize, as Proverbs says, that foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, that there is a way that a child would go that is not good. A child is foolish. A child is bent on his own destruction, and that we are to lovingly discipline our children. There was a much more sentimentalized view that came into vogue back in the middle of the 19th century during the dawn of the Victorian era, where children were seen as naturally innocent. And you see how our prison systems have changed because of that kind of idea, that we've gone from the idea that if someone steals, they're to repay sevenfold. If someone does certain things, there's a punishment, and then it's over and done with. But we invented our prison system because we believed that we could reform people. We opened penitentiaries and things like this. We'll come back to this. We have John with us from Salt Lake. John, good to have you with us.
Nice to be on the show tonight.
Could you speak up a bit? I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Nice to be on the show tonight.
Oh, good.
I'm not sure what your focus is tonight, but because you're going to do different stuff, but it is important that people recognize what sin is, and get into an in-depth study on the Ten Commandments, so they know what sin is. So you can go in a little deeper too. And my thing is what does it truly mean to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself?
Are you asking that now, or?
Yeah.
What does it mean to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself? That's your question?
Yes.
I apologize. We've got a bad connection. I could barely hear you there. Okay. Basically, it is to have everything in submission to God. It is that we are not being selfish. We're not seeking to serve ourselves. We're not seeking the praise of men. We're not seeking anything other than the glory of God. And by nature, that's not what we are. And even now, we are tainted. We're still sinners. We are reckoned righteous through the righteousness of Christ imputed to us. That sacrifice has been counted to us. We've been, the imagery is used of a cloak covering us. We're covered in His righteousness. But Martin Luther said that justification is like snow covering a dung heap. That we're now covered. Now, Roman Catholics love that quote because then they go off and say, see, he doesn't deal with the change that takes place. The process of sanctification, which is where we are enabled more and more to die to sin and live to righteousness, If you go back to the picture of the dung heap, yes, we're filthy, we're polluted. Our righteousnesses are as filthy rags. Literally in Isaiah, menstrual rags is the idea of the filth that we are, that our righteousnesses are like. We're covered in the righteousness of Christ, but the Spirit that we are given then enables us more and more to die to sin and live to righteousness. And that sanctification is finished when we are with Christ. And so
you're caught. My next question, that when we get into the sanctification thing, is okay. You hear it said. I've heard Christians come to me and say, "Are you saved?" And my thing is that, I've been baptized and all that, but are you saved? I think we are being saved. St. Paul says you're being saved. At least what I've understood in the Scriptures, that you're being saved. Salvation comes as you through the grace, grace of God, and not by any works that we can do, but we have to do our part.
Well,
what's your thing? There's got to be some action there to live out what God asks us to do. So in a sense, faith without works is dead. You have to do something.
Okay,
So being saved, Christ, through the gift given, is what I'm understanding. Through the gift given, we by connecting with this gift that God gives us, we can be saved. And we have to try to keep going along and living in God's love and grace, which you talked about tonight is I think it's about conquering sin. I mean, you can get to a point in your life to where sin can be uprooted within yourself, but through the power of God, of course. But it's an ongoing battle. No one's going to say, "Hey, you're." I agree with you. You talked about Mr. Packer and saying you reach these certain attitudes or levels, but really ultimately everyone's going to have temptation in their life till they die.
Well, here let me
with Christ we can
John, let me answer some of that,
okay.
And then I think it may make it a little bit clearer. When we talk about being saved, that is an overly broad term because it's something that different people use the same term in different ways, and so it's a biblical term, but we need to be careful about how we're using it. Have we been saved? Well, if our trust is in Jesus Christ alone, if we have been brought to a knowledge of our sin and see the mercy to be found in Him and trust no more in ourselves but put our trust on Him, we have been saved in the sense that we have been justified. Justification is a legal decree. It is a legal term that that Christ has come and fulfilled the law's demands for us. And then He has traded places with us. He took our sins and paid the penalty on the cross so that we might have His righteousness counted to us. And so justification is something that is a one-time act. When we are brought to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ, when our faith is placed in Him, then we are declared not guilty. And the way that we are brought to that faith, and we're going to flesh this out in some future weeks, Paul uses the imagery in Ephesians chapter 2 that we have been quickened, we have been made alive. The Spirit gives us that faith. It's not simply that we muster up some mental assent, but we have been made alive to where we have the eyes to see, we have the ears to hear, we apprehend our sin, and we apprehend the mercy in Jesus Christ, and so we flee to Him. And that is a declaration. I am as justified as I will ever be. Is that all of salvation, though? No. Am I going to be more just later? No, because I'm clothed in Christ's perfect righteousness. It's what He did for me. It's my union with Him that I've been baptized into His death. There's the union with Christ that is the basis of our justification. Paul says, it's no longer I that live, but Christ that lives in me. So there's justification. But when you read, say, Romans chapter 8, most people read verse 28, but they don't read the next verses. Romans 8:28 says, we know that God works all things together for good for those that love Him and are the called according to His purpose. But then it lays out, there's more than that, that whom He justifies, He will also sanctify. Hebrews 10 talks about that by one sacrifice, He has perfected forever. So it's a past act. Those that are being sanctified, an ongoing work. So I apologize for not having a better analogy. The Luther one is the one that is poignant. But basically, the snow covers the dung heap. But then that's justification. But sanctification is that we are transformed from enemy. We're transformed from sinners that hate God, that the natural man who cannot please God in any way. The Spirit convicts us, chastens us. The Spirit doesn't allow us to live in sin any longer. And so the Spirit teaches us more and more to love God. Ephesians 2:8-9 says, for by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast.
That's a gift given.
But then you quoted James 2, which is dealt with in the very next verse in Ephesians 2, in verse 10. It says, for we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, that He has ordained that we should walk therein. And I've used this analogy before, but it's basically like a dead apple tree. The cheap grace people who say that all that really matters is that you walked an aisle, prayed a prayer 20 years ago, and there's no fruit in your life. They're saying that apple tree, it doesn't matter whether it has any fruit. It can still be alive and never show any signs of life. The legalist says, well, it's by my faith plus my works that I'm made right with God. And they go out, they take juicy red apples and green leaves, and they tie them onto the apple tree, and you back up from it, and it looks like a live apple tree. And they say it's alive. No, it's not. But if you make the tree alive, then it bears fruit. You see, salvation is all too often pictured as a contract. If you do thus and so, God is bound that He will do thus and so. And it's often viewed as a contract, that if you muster up mental assent and this and that and the other, then God has to save you. And you can deny Him, you can go and become a murderer, you can do whatever you want to. But the biblical picture is that you're made alive. And if you're made alive, there are things that are inconsistent with being made alive. This is the reason that there's no power over sin in all these counterfeits. You can get a drunk sober, but it just pushes the sin somewhere else. It doesn't change the person. What you need is a new heart. You need the Old Testament picture of that heart of stone being plucked out and the heart of flesh put in its place. You must be born again. That's the message.
You're born by water and the Spirit. Yeah, you're baptized, but baptism, people are made new through baptism. Okay, now, what would you say to a Mormon? Would you recognize a Mormon baptism?
No.
Because simply, okay, go ahead.
The Mormons worship a God that is an idol. He's a fiction of their own imagination. He resembles the biblical God, but he was once a man. He, through through obedience to the gospel principles, or as Achieving a Celestial Marriage says, through obedience to law, he showed his worthiness for celestial exaltation, and then goes on and becomes the father of all these spirit children and everything else. It's the wrong God, the wrong gospel.
Yeah, I living in Utah, but I think I've encountered the people. They'll come around. Mormons will say, "Well, we all believe in the same thing. The Father's going to." Really, I don't agree with that because who is this God that you are worshiping? And you got to get into the Trinitarian perspective of Mormons and the Trinitarian perspective of Christianity that's been handed on for years.
John, let me flesh out one more thing for you here. Yeah. In terms of sanctification, we love God because we have been born again. And there are things such as in 1 Corinthians 6, it goes through, it names homosexuality, adultery, covetousness, being a thief. You can't live in these sins any longer. Galatians 5 talks about the works of the flesh, that you can't live in these things any longer if you're truly a Christian. If you say that you're in the light and you're walking in darkness, 1 John, you're a liar. How do we know that we love God? That His commandments are not burdensome to us. And it's not just the Mormons. I'm not picking on them.
Right.
I've heard evangelicals, very popular evangelical church, one of their youth leaders was taking issue with some materials that we had on one of our book tables. And I asked her, there was an elder in that church that was very well known to have been an adulterer in the ministry and all kinds of other things. And she said, well, what does that have to do with anything? And I said, we're given biblical qualifications for elders. And this is a person that there were all kinds of issues that were very publicly known and fessed up to, and they thought it was a testimony of grace, sort of like in 1 Corinthians 5, where they thought it was a wonderful thing that they've got this man married to his father's wife. And Paul, you can sense him almost pulling out his hair, saying, you're glorying in what the Gentiles won't even talk about. A man has married his father's wife? That's immoral. These are things that are inconsistent. And when I went through what the biblical qualifications were, the response was, well, you don't think that God actually intends us to keep those, do you? And I said, why else would God tell us that this is what we're supposed to do?
I agree. I agree with you. My thing is I still think that everybody's going to have a temptation, and they have even as a baptized person,
right?
We have freedom of choice.
Well, let me
strive to always live in God's love and grace. Yes, but we have to act. We have to do it. And if we fall short, God is there. He was there, present with us. I've always believed that.
But see, it's never our worthiness.
He will forgive us. But I've talked to fundamentalist Christians, and they'll say, "Well," I says, "if you go across the street and kill somebody, does that mean you're saved?" Do you believe that?
No, John. Let me.
Okay, so but see,
John,
would a Christian
John,
do that? We'd hope not.
I don't want to.
We don't know how human beings.
Listen, John. I don't want to cut you off, but
okay,
let me answer your question. When we have been brought to faith in Jesus Christ, we are righteous. We're as righteous as we will ever be, and yet we're still sinners. But we're being sanctified.
Right.
And when you look at, we just went through this Sunday morning. In Luke 1, you have Zacharias and Elizabeth, the father and mother of John the Baptist, and they are described as righteous, and they are walking in God's commandments and statutes blameless. So they're given the highest possible description, and yet when confronted by the when confronted by Gabriel, telling him that his prayer has been answered, they're going to have a son, and all these wonderful things, what's the first thing he does? He doubts. He's a sinner. We see that David, though he is a man after God's own heart, he becomes an adulterer and a murderer. Peter receives the Holy Spirit. Remember, Christ breathes on them. This is before Pentecost. It says, receive the Holy Spirit. And yet, he ends up denying his Lord. Yet, he's restored. What the focus of sanctification is, Paul tells us that Christ is just as much our sanctification as he is our justification. And so we have to remember that Christ isn't someone that we just needed at one day 20 years ago. We need Christ every moment of every day, because the greatest saint that has ever walked the face of the earth is still just a sinner. He's a righteous sinner. We've got a call I need to squeeze in here. We've got just a moment left. Miguel, if you can make your question about 10 seconds.
Oh, it's not a question. It's just a comment really quickly.
Sure.
I just wanted to say for the guy that just called, I think his name is John, that we've been saved, we're being saved, and we shall be saved. And also, on top of that, we are perfect in our position, but not in our practice. And so, there is a part in the Bible, I can't remember where it is, I'm sorry.
Miguel, we were just about out of time. I appreciate the call. Yes, we are saved, we are being saved, and we will be saved. But we need to be clear. We have been justified, and we are as justified as we will ever be. We are being sanctified, and we will be glorified. And all those come under the general heading of salvation. We're going to flesh more of these out, but I hope you see that what we believe, what we understand, it changes the way that we live. I'd like to invite you to tune in next week and see more as we go through a discussion of the nature of God, the nature of our salvation. Also invite you to worship with us. We meet Sunday mornings at 8630 West, 2700 South at 11 a.m. We're going through the Gospel of Luke, and we meet at 6:30 p.m. in Logan at 1315 East, 700 North in the Faith and Fellowship Center that we rent there. If you'd like to watch any of the shows that we've done before, they're available on the web. Until next time, God bless.